Hi, everyone. Matthew Klippenstein here with CHFCA. Thank you very much for tuning into this webinar. We'll get started very shortly with Alex Simakov and the analysis of the Ontario low carbon hydrogen strategy. So sit tight, please. Thank you very much. Just got to get a couple little things noodled out on this end. Hi, everyone. Matthew Klippenstein here. Hold on, let me get that tree motif out of the way. First off, just want to, am I coming through okay? Is there any background noise? I've got a little fan running here. All good? Okay, super. Thank you very much. All right, so this is our August 24th webinar on Ontario's hydrogen future, analyze the province's low carbon hydrogen strategy. Our speaker is Alex Simakov from Policy Exchange, a group out of the UK. In terms of session description, I just want to note this out here. So in April 7th, the Government of Ontario published its first low-carbon hydrogen strategy, which sets out the province's vision and expectations for the growing hydrogen sector in that province. It includes a number of proposed actions to enable hydrogen production and expand the burgeoning low-carbon hydrogen economy, including launching innovative projects, identifying hydrogen hubs, and proposing related changes to regulatory frameworks and policies. And so in this webinar, we're going to have Alex Simakov from Policy Exchange, formerly a senior associate at Sussex and Strategy Group, who will examine the key takeaways and its implications for sector stakeholders like yourselves. I do also want to make sure to highlight that Nicholas Hilario, I'm not sure if he's put his camera on, but Nicholas is our operations manager here, and he basically runs everything. I'm just the still photographed face there, saying a few words here in front of Alex. Here's Nicholas. Not sure if you want to say any words, Nicholas, or number of attendees or things of that sort, but we can give way to Alex shortly.
Thanks, Matthew. Just want to emphasize to our attendees. Just want to emphasize to our attendees today to please keep their microphones on mute, and feel free to enter your questions here in the Teams chat. There will be a recording of this webinar made available afterwards. Thank you all.
Super. And with that, I guess we'll hand it over to Alex.
Thanks, Matthew. Thank you, Nicholas, and everyone else, ladies and gentlemen, who's joined us here today. Let me get my deck up here, and then we can get started. If I could have control of the screen. One second. Share tray. Nicholas, could you put that up? I'm not seeing the option on my end.
Sure, I'll put that up for you, Alex. One moment here.
Thanks.
Join the conference too.
Oh, yeah.
There we
go. Full screen. Perfect. One more and we can get to the agenda. Excellent. Good morning, folks. Good afternoon, depending where you are. Thank you very much for joining us for a discussion about Ontario's hydrogen strategy. We have a brief agenda here to get through to orient us on the conversation. I'd like to start with an introduction to where Ontario's politics have been for the past 4 years and how we got to this moment. Talk about the strategy itself, and then talk about some of the mechanisms that are going to help bring it to reality. First and foremost on that list is federal funding opportunities. We have the opportunity for hydrogen hubs, which is a key concept for Ontario strategy, the role of the Independent Electricity System Operator, the ISO. And number 6 really is the biggest slide, and where I really want to spend a bit of time on is the potential for Ontario to introduce new rate options, which I think and a lot of folks think is going to be really the critical question, whether Ontario can reach the next stage in the hydrogen race. Then we want to talk about what next steps for the economy look like. And lastly, given its timeliness, there's been a lot of activity between Canada and Germany with their eyes on Atlantic Canada and Stephenville, Newfoundland, and hopefully talk about that a little bit and what it means for Ontario and the rest of the Canadian economy. And then we can have a brief discussion and hopefully some Q&As there. Next slide. Ontario has, for folks who've been following, has been a bit of a roller coaster on the electricity and the energy front over the past decade. In particular, we've experienced a doubling of electricity prices from 2008 and 2018 in a slightly complicated journey. It's driven by a myriad of factors, and no one issue is responsible, but we've had nuclear refurbishments, we've had feed-in tariffs for renewables, conservation programs, out-of-market gas contracts, and a lot else. And really, in particular, what we had was a forecast that demand would continue to go up that was cratered by the Great Recession, and we had a great imbalance. In particular, one of the things that generated was a tremendous surplus baseload generation, where we had really the politically sensitive situation where we were exporting our surplus power to competing jurisdictions in the US, like Pennsylvania and Ohio, at a loss, or in fact, actually paying them to take it. As you can see on the upper right graph, prices have gone up significantly while wholesale prices have decreased. The yellow bar represents global adjustment, being out-of-market costs that all consumers are responsible for. As this price increase continued to accelerate, the previous Liberal government introduced a number of measures to help relieve some of these system pressures, which really meant moving costs around between different consumers. In particular, folks might be aware of the ICI program, the Industrial Conservation Initiative, which allows Class A consumers, the 2,000 or so largest electricity consumers in the province, to significantly reduce their global adjustment exposure depending on their responsiveness, or rather share of consumption, during the 5 peak hours of the year. What that effectively means is that if you're in the ICI program and you manage to not consume any electricity during those 5 hours, you're effectively exempt from the entirety of the global adjustment of your costs. So you're paying only that blue bar on top, which can turn out to as little as 3 or 4 cents a kilowatt hour. In fact, one of the most competitive prices in North America. However, those costs, of course, were shared across with other consumers, and the government eventually was forced to take on a significant amount of those costs from the rate base onto the tax base. Now, what that means is the middle bar on the left, on the middle graph on the right, where the provincial government and the Treasury is now taking on about almost $7 billion a year of subsidies for a $21 billion electricity market, so about a third. Obviously, a very significant cost, and that includes new costs that were taken on during the COVID-19 pandemic, and costs that we are hopefully going to see decrease, but any intervention that we're going to have in the near future will continue to push those costs up. And the last point, and perhaps the one most salient for the hydrogen sector, is that we do have an approaching capacity gap that could grow to as high as 5 gigawatts over the next 10 years. A couple of forces driving this. One, we have growing demand. A lot of new industrial and light manufacturing is setting up across Ontario, especially there in the Southwest, with agriculture and cannabis sectors are booming. A lot of transportation electrification. EV adoption is not quite the pace as BC and Quebec, but it is picking up, and we're experimenting with a lot more zero emissions vehicle that will continue to accelerate over the course of the decade. The most urgent factor here, of course, is the retirement of the Pickering Nuclear Generating Station in 2024 that can take off about 3,000 megawatts by that time. So fortunately, we do have several capacity procurements currently underway. Just last week, the ISO affirmed that 55 proponents were eligible for the long-term request for proposals. We're going to see the results of these auctions coming over the course of the next year. In fact, there are now 6 different procurement streams in line. So if we can get some of those streams up and running effectively, get great bids in and have capacity built, I think we'll be in great shape. But if we have less than expected participation and we do have a bit of a capacity shortfall, that is something that the hydrogen sector will have to navigate, as other sectors might get priority access to some of these shortfalls in availability. Next. Despite some, I think, very unfair media characterizations of the Ford government's perspective of climate change, since the appointment of Minister Todd Smith last June, the province has adopted a very and increasingly adoptive, innovative approach to energy policy. On top of that, we have Minister Smith has committed to a plan to decarbonize electricity generation, and in fact, just yesterday, issued a formal letter to the IESO requesting an expedition on their report on pathways to phase out natural gas generation. Their report is going to be due on October 7th, and it's going to help inform these procurement channels. Besides that, a lot of great policy innovation on the micro level. We have new programs for enabling overnight EV charging, great programs to support grid scale energy storage in the procurements, third-party net metering, and a very long list of small changes that are going to build up to serious dividends over the next 10 years. Very relevant for our conversation as well. Back in January, the Ministry of Northern Development Mines introduced a discussion paper on geological carbon storage. What that's going to allow is it's going to free up a significant amount of Crown land for CCUS, carbon capture and underground storage, as well as some regulatory clarity on safety standards and how some of these CCUS programs can be put into place. Ontario has very favorable geology for CCUS, as well as a significant natural gas and salt caverns that can store what I understand to be several decades worth of Ontario's emissions under the right economic conditions. For our conversation today is the report that came out on April 7th, Ontario's low carbon hydrogen strategy. In a nutshell, it outlines 8 policies that aim to generate an 8-fold increase over low carbon hydrogen production. Now, there's a couple of key points here that we want to touch on. The first is that there is no distinguishment between blue and green hydrogen. Green, of course, is produced from renewable electricity through an electrolyzer. Blue, however, is similar to the conventional form of hydrogen production through natural gas using steam methane reformation, the difference being that we capture the carbon emitted and sequester it to prevent it from emission. A big part of the strategy is focused on hydrogen hubs, something that the CHFCA has been a big proponent of for many years. In a nutshell, the costs of distributing and transporting the hydrogen are one of the key barriers to adoption. By concentrating its development in a couple of key areas of high demand, we'll be able to reduce those costs, achieve scale faster, and drive adoption. Likewise, we have a very big opportunity for pink hydrogen, which is generated from nuclear, as folks can see from the graph, pie graph on the lower right. Nuclear, that's Ontario's sources of electricity generation in 2020. Nuclear represents 57%. We're going to continue to have that as a core part of our energy mix, and along with partners elsewhere in Canada, including Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and Alberta, nuclear will continue to play a big role, both for hydrogen and elsewhere. One of the advantages Ontario has in the nuclear space is one of the largest and most advanced natural gas networks in North America. It includes storage systems, pipelines throughout much of the province, and of course the peaker plants themselves. The plan envisions great prospects for hydrogen blending to reduce the carbon intensity of natural gas and potentially a wholesale conversion of some of our natural gas infrastructure to lower carbon or no carbon intensity hydrogen. Lastly, or penultimate, one of the big ambitions we have for our hydrogen strategy in Ontario is for industrial decarbonization. One of the major steel makers in Ontario, Dofasco in Hamilton, has announced plans by 2027 as part of their conversion to an electric arc furnace that they will be interested in consuming as much as 750 megawatts worth of low carbon hydrogen for that process, something that can be phased in over many years and reduce the carbon intensity. Lastly, the biomass, biogas, and ammonia in new energy systems, and how we can leverage our very advanced forestry and waste systems to contribute to our hydrogen supply, availability, and consumption. Next. Serendipitously, the federal budget of last year came out on the exact same day, April 7th, and it contained a great number of goodies for hydrogen. And so really emphasizing the multi-partisan support that this sector has on all levels of government. A couple of quick funding sources to chime off here for us to keep in mind as we get through the presentation. First and foremost is a new $15 billion Canada Growth Fund that's going to accelerate private capital into the sector, an autonomous agency. As well, folks here will be familiar with the Canada Infrastructure Bank that has helped bring a number of utility scale projects to fruition across the country. They now have an expanded role with an explicit permission and encouragement to participate in hydrogen production, transportation, distribution, as well as CCUS. There's a new investment tax credit of up to 30% that's going to be released in the forthcoming fall economic statement, as well as a CCUS tax credit of up to 60% for the direct air capture, 50% for other CCUS, and so forth. I think on this point, it's important to recognize a lot of these CCUS and DAC measures are really addressed at Alberta. The federal government envisions and is planning for a very deep conversion and a transition over several years or decades from Alberta's existing oil and gas sector to be a real global champion in hydrogen, especially blue hydrogen, which is an area where Alberta and Edmonton are very eager to expand and build their sector. Ottawa's giving them every chance, in particular, by setting the deadline for the CCUS investment tax credit by 2030, at which point it drops in half. It hopes to drive capital investment into the space as quickly as possible to get those emissions intensities of oil sands projects down as quickly as possible in alignment with our Paris goals. And lastly, there's a continuation of many billions of dollars of existing green funding streams, including SREPS, Rural Communities Fund, the $2.2 billion Low Carbon Economy Fund, $500 million for zero emissions vehicle infrastructure, and a similar amount for heavy duty zero emissions vehicle. So if you have a hydrogen project that is looking for funding, the federal government is very interested in talking to you and would love a meeting. Next slide. In Ontario here, we really see a really big role for the Crown Corporation, in particular, OPG subsidiary Tura Power. They've really spearheaded this space and have came out kicking with a lot of big plans to move the sector forward. First on that list is the Niagara Hydrogen Center. That's going to be a 20 megawatt electrolyzer at the Sir Adam Beck Hydroelectric Station, leveraging surplus baseload generation that would otherwise be spilled. We're going to use that power to convert it to clean hydrogen, green hydrogen instead. From the government, they're going to be offering an exemption to the gross revenue charge, effectively the rental fee that we charge hydro dams for using the water. Legislation is still to be passed or is in the works, so we hope to get further clarity on that quite soon. With support from Natural Resource Canada's Clean Fuels Fund, we're envisioning a COD by as early as 2024, which I think is a great pace. And progress has already been made since the announcement back in April. Just this June, they've selected CEM Engineering and Zachary Davy Engineering to conduct detailed design and project permitting while project work continues through the year. So that's very exciting. And in fact, Tura Power has just announced a selection of a new president who will be starting in September. So definitely the space to look at as far as Ontario's hydrogen economy is concerned. They're not sitting on their laurels there, exploring a number of other hub opportunities from their existing resources. Halton Hills Energy Center, they're already looking at another 20 megawatt electrolyzer using their facilities in Nanticoke to produce 10 million kilograms annually, potentially, as well as Brighton and Lambton. You know, a lot of the output here, there's been some questions about where to take it and what to do with it. Key priority for the near term seems to be displacing diesel engines for heavy duty trucks and long haul trucking. That's some of the one of the more cost competitive applications. Likewise, Bruce Power, which runs the Bruce nuclear generating station in the Bruce Huron County, also have a study underway that they'll be coming out later this year, early next. And one of the opportunities they have is to use nuclear maneuvering effectively when they get told to power down to relieve overgeneration. Instead of powering down, they're going to continue to operate at optimal capacity and use that surplus electricity to generate hydrogen as well. They're looking at the potential of investing in small modular reactors and using those very high thermal values to generate pink hydrogen as well for use throughout southwestern Ontario. Next slide. We have a role to play by the system operator, the IESO in Ontario. Minister Smith, in releasing a hydrogen strategy, and instructed the agency to come back with a strategy and program options to integrate low carbon hydrogen into the power grid. So there's a report back due on Halloween. What we envision is that it will likely include a targeted call for proposals through the ISO's Grid Innovation Fund, which is a specific innovation funding scheme that they have that targets a different part of the sector each year. For example, last year, they had targeted distributed energy resources, DERs, ultimately raising $37 million for 4 projects, 10 million of which came from the ISO and the rest from other investment sources. So as far as distributed electrolysis goes and smaller projects that are ready to move out of the lab and into the field, the ISO's fund is going to be a great opportunity to get those. While they have to be located in Ontario, the originators of the projects can be anywhere from Canada or frankly around the world. Definitely something to look out to for startups here and other venture groups that are looking for funding opportunities. As far as the ISO is concerned, one of their main objectives here is really to drive down the cost curve, as you can see on the right, report from Morgan Stanley, on where electrolyzer and fuel cell costs are going to be headed over the next 10 years. Naturally, like with any technology, as we've seen with wind, solar, and batteries, there's a very aggressive cost curve declines that have exceeded all expectations. As we get more electrolyzers and fuel cells out to the field, as we start scaling manufacturing and moving away from boutique, almost handmade products towards mass production, we're going to see a dramatic cost decline and a very close narrowing of the gap from current gray hydrogen consumption towards green hydrogen consumption is going to be increasingly competitive, even without the carbon price. As far as what the ISO is looking for in these projects, we can speculate on a couple of objectives. The first, they definitely want to see projects that are going to be commercializing excess or curtailed electricity. Right now, we still have wind turbines that are told to power down overnight on weekends. We have some solar that we can use during weekend days, some hydroelectricity that's too far north to get to loads in southern urban areas. Let's find an opportunity to turn that into hydrogen and decarbonize some of local consumers. Two, we want to be able to relieve capacity transmission constraints and capacity needs. As mentioned, we have a very large power gap coming up. If we can leverage some of that surplus and curtailed energy and use that to relieve grid constraints, the ISO is going to see that as a very big win. We'll certainly look favorably upon those applications. Lastly, as mentioned, the ISO has a mandate to decarbonize Ontario's electricity grid, and we're going to see the report on that coming out on October 7th. Any opportunity to use low carbon hydrogen to help phase out some of the natural gas or displace it in part, I think will be looked upon favorably and will be very competitive within the broader application streams. Next slide, please. This is, I would like to think, the most important slide we're going to touch on today. A few weeks after the report came out, Minister Smith followed up with a posting to the Environmental Registry of Ontario about the proposal for the introduction of 3 new electricity rates that would be available only to hydrogen producers, really elevating kind of the importance of the sector on what it can do for the province. And I want to touch on these and why they're important and what we can do to help bring these to reality. The first is, as mentioned, we have the ICI program, the Industrial Conservation Initiative, that, when successfully participated upon, allows consumers to access some of the cheapest rates in North America available to industrial customers. Right now, that is limited to consumers of over 1 megawatt, on top of which you need to be participating in the program for 12 months to get a reading of your load profile before you get phased into the system and have access to the lower rates. However, they're proposing the possibility of lowering the threshold for eligibility to 50 kilowatts, which will effectively include every use of electrolysis in the province, as well as immediate enrollment, where you don't have to be exposed to much higher prices for the first 12 months before rolling in. This would be an exceptional opportunity, especially for distributed electrolysis. Right now, one of the leading spaces is material handling vehicles like forklifts. We're going to see this expanding into underground mine vehicles. Having that reduced cost is going to make it much more competitive, not just with the EVs, but especially with diesel and gasoline powered vehicles. Secondly, we're looking at the option of co-locating electrolyzers at generating facilities and allowing them to purchase electricity through has to be a third party, and it'll allow for some contract amendments. Again, this could be curtailed generation. It could also be generation at points of lower price, where a more efficient usage is to use that power to use generation. Now, we put forward an idea that could take this forward a level. The challenge, I think, with this proposal is, one, when we look at, say, hydro resources or wind resources, a lot of them may be located in difficult remote locations. A lot of them may be located far away from hydrogen loads, potential consumers, or are in geographically sensitive, ecologically sensitive bases. One challenge we have is that the intermittency of these products, the curtailment, isn't frequent enough to reach a high enough capacity factor that the hydrogen will be cost competitive. It really does not work if we're only going to have 4 or 5 hours a day to use the electrolyzer, if that's the most curtailment we can get. One way to work through that challenge is the potential for aggregation, which will, for example, allow an electrolyzer to be paired with, say, half a dozen wind and hydro projects in a location on the grid, allowing them to use the different curtailment periods throughout to reach a much higher capacity factor and therefore lower costs. This would, of course, require virtual power purchase agreement, VPPAs, that aren't allowed in Ontario, but hydrogen might be the way to get that. And those discussions are underway, and the government is looking at options of whether this could be available for hydrogen. Option 3, and this one is the most likely, and we understand likely to go through already, is previously announced interruptible rate pilot, where large industrial consumers will be offered a lower price of electricity in exchange for the ISO's permission to cut them off under certain grid conditions, peak demand, and so forth. Would be the simplest to introduce. Now, while all of these options would be great, they are competing with a lot of other energy sector priorities that is facing the minister's office. We have a capacity shortfall coming up. We have to decarbonize the grid and phase out natural gas in some timeline. We have a lot of EVs coming online. We have aging infrastructure throughout the province. There's a lot that Minister Smith and his team is facing on. if we want these policies to be realized and implemented in 2022, policies that will make an existential difference, I think, for Ontario's competition in the national and international hydrogen economy, please write the minister a letter and let him know that this is going to be really important, and that if he does this, it will help you invest in Ontario, generate jobs in Ontario, and drive growth. For reference, we worked with the Ontario Chamber of Commerce to write a letter. We'll send a link in the chat. Please borrow that, send it to the minister's office, send it to the staff somewhere on this call now, send it to the bureaucracy or the ISO. Let them know that this is important for us, that we have an opportunity, and that if these policies go through, they're going to see real dividends paid over the coming months and years. If you have any questions, if you have any thoughts, please shoot me a note over LinkedIn or in the chat. Happy to chat about how we can help bring some of these projects to reality over 2022, 2023. Thank you. Next slide. So where does that leave us as a province? And where does that leave us as a sector? Some folks on this call were around in the 1990s when hydrogen was also having a really big moment and everyone got very excited and the bubble popped and didn't really go anywhere. And today we have conversations about using hydrogen to heat everyone's homes and to fly planes and to sail ships and do all kinds of amazing things. And I hope that happens, and I'm fighting for it. Not all of it will. But what we do know is that the very base minimum right now, Canada produces and consumes 3 million tons of gray hydrogen. At the very, very least, if nothing else, we need to convert that incredibly carbon intensive process to green and blue hydrogen, low carbon intensity, as soon as possible. And we know that based on the escalating carbon tax elevator, that green and blue, low carbon, will be competitive with gray by mid-decade, if not potentially faster. So at the very least, the economic opportunity here is already in the billions of dollars and is well worth our attention, if nothing else. But we know as well, while we're on this call, that hydrogen can do so much more. Hydrogen can not only help us decarbonize our industrial processes, it can help drive buses, it can help drive forklifts, that it's already happening. It can help use it for marine transit, especially as ammonia. It can do a lot of potential, and we're only going to discover more and more of its applications as investment continues to flood into the sector. So what this means for Ontario as well is we're really excited about that, the fact that we have a really clean electricity grid, 95% emissions free. But electricity only contributes about 16% of Ontario's total energy consumption. 3/4 of that are still represented by natural gas and petroleum. A lot of that we could electrify, but a lot of that simply can't, either because the heat isn't high enough or other constraints like grid capacity and plants. We're not going to get that through electricity. The rest of that road will have to be carried on by hydrogen. And that's why we're on this call today to help push forward that opportunity. So what can we do? First, I want to acknowledge that the strategy that came out didn't just pop into the ministry's imagination that came forward. It came as a result of many years of stakeholder advocacy and engagement, policy proposals, and clarity on here's what you can achieve if you put forward some of these programs. To get more momentum, we have to continue to participate in these programs. We have to continue to be vocal and engaged. For example, we have the ISOs coming out with the Green Innovation Fund funding. Let's get a lot of proposals in there. Let's get a lot of applications for funding and show that this is a serious sector that's ready to participate. Let's get letters into the ministry to show that those rates are going to make a difference. And once those rates are made available, let's sign up for them and use them and help drive conversions from fossil fuel resources towards emissions-free or low emissions hydrogen instead. So how do we get to the next stage of this? I think there's going to be two big factors that can help tip us from into the next level of the hydrogen economy. The first is we need to see municipal fuel cell bus adoption. Fortunately, that's already underway. A number of municipalities, including particularly Mississauga with My Way, already have pilot programs underway to bring on a number of fuel cell buses and are going to help scale up and drive more across the province. Northland as well, which has to cover long distances and cold temperatures, is perfectly suited for hydrogen buses. And I know we're in talks as well with Qtrix and others to help drive adoption. As these help come to fruition and as hydrogen becomes more available, we're going to see more adoption and driving a virtuous cycle of decreasing fuel cell costs and low carbon hydrogen inputs as well. What's really going to make the biggest difference as well is if we look at Ontario, we look at southwestern Ontario, there's a tremendous petrochemical industry there that are the main users overwhelmingly of hydrogen in the province. Those can start phasing in low carbon hydrogen into their gray mix and reducing their carbon footprint as a way to reduce their exposure to the carbon price. What can make a big difference is the government, particularly the federal government with significant funding commitments, can help offset that difference between gray and green hydrogen to help ensure that anyone in Ontario who's producing green hydrogen will have a guaranteed buyer. The biggest challenge that this sector has faced has been the classic chicken or the egg problem. We've had a number of folks who are really excited to generate hydrogen, but can't get the right costs in place because they don't have an offtake agreement and they don't know what to do with it afterwards. Likewise, we've had a lot of great consumers of hydrogen that are really eager to reduce their carbon footprint and be more sustainable, but until they can get a sure and reliable supply of low carbon hydrogen, they're not ready to invest significant capital necessary to be hydrogen ready. The federal government, with significant financial resources, can play a critical role in bringing some of these opportunities together and ensuring that producers and consumers will have confidence that if they make the conversion and the investment, that they'll be somewhat a partner on the other end. To think about what Ontario's next steps look like is really there are two development pathways. The first is hydrogen as energy. Ontario is going to need hydrogen to help fuel its electricity system, to help keep the lights on, to help heat homes and businesses, and to drive some of the growing industrial processes. That's straightforward. But we also have hydrogen as technology, much in the way that the Canadian government is viewing, the Ontario government is viewing EVs. We've driven a tremendous amount to leverage our advanced manufacturing sector to take a leading role in the production of cathodes, anodes, and other battery components. We're producing powertrains and we're producing many components that are going to go into EVs around the world, including some leading brands like Tesla now manufacture their parts in Ontario because of the depth of skill and talent we have in our manufacturing space. So Ontario doesn't necessarily have some of the advantages that Quebec does with tremendous hydroelectricity or Alberta with massive natural gas deposits. What we do have is an advanced manufacturing base that's ready to take advantage of these. And I see some folks on the call in Ontario that are already building electrolyzers and fuel cells in Ontario. I think that's where one of the areas Ontario has a competitive advantage in, and we're going to continue driving it. That said, it's a virtuous cycle. The more hydrogen we consume in the province, the more hydrogen we produce in the province, the more demand there's going to be for electrolyzer and fuel cell production, driving a virtuous cycle and bringing costs down, much like we've seen with wind turbines, solar panels, and batteries in Ontario and around the world. Next slide, please. Of course, we've had some huge news, almost wall-to-wall coverage, especially in the Globe and Mail front page, about some recent developments in Atlantic Canada. German Chancellor visited and met with Justin Trudeau with significant delegations from both German and Canadian industries, did a tour culminating in Stephenville, Newfoundland, where they signed a non-binding joint declaration of intent to establish a green hydrogen corridor, leveraging offshore wind power, and have a very ambitious timeline for the first deliveries to take place in 2025. The funding is going to be provided through the Clean Fuels Fund and the Net Zero Accelerator on our end. Germany likewise will fund and support their industrial consumers in building intake and distribution resources on their end. Now, there's been a lot of, I think, skepticism and some criticism of the space. Folks have pointed out that the 164 wind turbines have yet to be approved. And there's no plan yet for the electrolysis and ammonia plants that need to be built. But what we do have is a $1 trillion sector growing before us. And that's not going to be reached by cautious small steps. It's not going to be reached by timidity and waiting for everything to line up before we make a bit of an investment in the space. What this does demonstrate to the world is that Canada is taking the hydrogen opportunity seriously. The federal government is ready to commit significant funds behind it. And we now have a chance through regulatory approvals, streamlining, through funding agreements, and through having the federal government play as a champion rather than an arbitrator of the sector to really secure a space in what is going to be a really competitive global market over the next 5-10 years. Maybe we don't hit the 25 target, maybe we hit it for 26. But I, for one, am tremendously excited for the amount of coverage we're generating and the amount of investor confidence this kind of accord is going to drive across the economy. And it really shows our ambition in the space. As well, slightly less coverage, but there's been several announcements as well. It's not just the Porter Wind. We also have Everwind Fuels signed a slightly more advanced, but still non-binding offtake agreement with Uniper and E.ON for 500,000 tons of green ammonia each. And, you know, there's been people ask, what are the differences between now and then hydrogen boom in the 90s? And I want to point to two things that have happened. Earlier this year, the 8,000-ton Susho Frontier sailed from Hastings, Australia to Kobe, Japan, a journey of, I'll note, twice the distance between Newfoundland and Germany, completing the very first liquefied hydrogen delivery in the world. They chilled the hydrogen to minus 253 degrees. They froze it to 1/800th of its original size and successfully completed the journey. So yeah, there's logistical barriers and there's long distances, but we now have a clear proof of concept that's going to help bring this to reality. And if the Australians can do it, I'm sure as heck think the Canadians can pull it off as well. And another point out, last week, a US insurer, Marsh McLennan Coast, introduced what is now the very first insurance project for large-scale hydrogen. So when we think about what didn't work in the 90s, a lot of it, well, the technology wasn't quite there, and it is now. And more importantly, the financial products weren't there to help fund and provide the long-term patient capital and associated resources to bring these hydrogen projects to fruition. We have that now. They're coming online, and they're going to continue coming online. And every geopolitical wind we've had, first and foremost, the crisis in Eastern Europe is putting more and more resource and more confidences in the potential for Canada to play a tremendous and a leading role in the hydrogen economy of the future. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much there, Alex. That's very helpful. At this point, we can turn over and start the Q&A portion. If people would like to put their questions in the chat, that'd be fantastic. I do know that there was already an inquiry if we could get the hyperlinks for slide 8, which I think had the sample letter for the minister as well as one other detail. I checked the PDF you'd sent over, Alex. I'm not sure if they were hyperlinked in, but I see you're putting that in right now.
Yeah.
So just to start things off, I'm curious, do you have any ballpark idea what the electricity cost is from Bruce Power, from some of these nuclear power plants, as opposed to the, I guess, the market value you said sometimes turns negative? And the reason I'm asking is that I know that like a big portion of electricity costs all consumers pay is the transmission distribution, T&D. It can be higher than the generation cost. If you were on site with an electrolyzer, then presumably it would be possible to exchange, through a third party, the electricity at the generation cost without encumbering oneself with that the rest of the balance of system. Is that doable?
Absolutely. So that's technically it's very doable. It's easier than the current way, frankly. And that's really where option 2 on slide 8 comes into place of co-locating. If we allow us to co-locate, depending on the regulatory structure around it, we could and should, frankly, exempt ourselves from transmission charges if those resources are not being used. So that will dramatically increase the costs. And in conversations we've had about what are the next goals we have for advocacy at the provincial level, it's really relieving and reducing transmission costs, especially when we can put them to greater use. It's not a full exemption, certainly a reduction that allows us to be more competitive on the hydrogen space. With Bruce Power, they have an even greater advantage there. By co-locating, there's no transmissions or wires involved. One of the opportunities as well is by co-locating, we could potentially, again, depending on the regulatory structure, avoid global adjustment charges. So if it's co-located and it's a direct purchase from the producer, that could be one of the regulatory accommodations. Bruce Power having tremendous thermal value, both at Bruce and the potential for its future SMRs, further reduces the cost of producing the hydrogen. So overall, I mean, we'll be looking at, some folks have quoted 3 cents a kilowatt hour as a conservative estimate, and I think that would be very competitive or on par with producing it gray under current conditions, especially with natural gas prices remaining very high despite the recent dip.
Right, and I think 3 cents Canadian would be ballpark 2.5 cents US, which is valuable context since most price assumptions are priced in the US. So that's very helpful to know. I was curious. Now, which I believe it's called the Quebec City Windsor Corridor, Highway 401, which is Windsor, basically Detroit, up to the other end of Ontario, and then Quebec Autoroute van, 20. Combined, it's a very massive trucking logistics sector. Do you know if the province has hinted at any plans to deploy some, or focus attention, say, on that corridor, which should be fantastic, both for hydrogen for trucking, but also many battery electric trucks as well?
Absolutely. So we've looked at some of the hydrogen hub locations considered by Atura are very conveniently located on that 401 stretch from Detroit to Quebec City. I'll point out as well, Quebec City Gasifier is putting up an electrolyzer facility near Ottawa, not far from that corridor as well. They do have fairly cheaper electricity rates than Ontario does. They'll be able to plug the system in there. While the first project, the Niagara Hydrogen Center, is slightly out of the way of that main corridor, still very robust traffic coming in and out between Buffalo. And really that's what's held up the ability for long-haul truckings to convert to hydrogen. By a lot of studies, it could already be cheaper now, but if you don't have a reliable supply along the way, this certainly will make that shift. So I do want to see folks leveraging the federal government's $500 million zero emissions vehicle infrastructure fund. That's something that's almost ideally suited to setting up hydrogen refueling centers along the way and being great anchor tenants or anchor customers for low carbon hydrogen production from distributed sources.
Right. Okay, super. Maybe I'll turn over to some of the questions we've gotten in the chat here. Let's see. Robert Squires had asked, presumably the hydrogen technology strategy also includes building, exporting end-use products with hydrogen tech. I'm guessing that probably would. Hydrogenics, now Cummins, is based around Mississauga, I believe, right? That would be a big win for the government there.
Absolutely. So Mississauga is turning into a bit of a hydrogen hub. I know we have folks here from Next Hydrogen Solutions that have one of the largest, if not the largest, hydrogen electrolyzer production facility in Canada, if not North America. They have a great low-cost product that's been partnered with Walmart, Canadian Tire, and I believe Toyota as well, if I'm not mistaken. We have Hydrogen Optimized in Owen Sound, Northern Ontario as well, that is putting these pieces together. A lot of these folks were involved, along with Cummins, Purchase Hydrogenics, were involved in the production of the hydrogen strategy and consulted on that. I think they're in a competitive space already, and the resources are quite strong. What they need to see is surety of demand as that comes together, and as we have large buyers like the Fasco making a conversion to accommodate some green hydrogen consumption. I think hopefully that will drive some scale and drop their costs compared to what we can get from, say, Asia significantly has much lower cost electrolyzers for the moment.
I'm going to skip ahead a few questions because I'm sure that many people asked it or are wondering it. This is from Alan Sutton. Will President Biden's $1 per kilogram, so $1.30 Canadian per kilogram, challenge in the USA, I think that's a goal, $1 a kilogram by 2030, have a positive or negative impact on the Ontario hydrogen industry? And I would probably fold in the Inflation Reduction Act, which has spectacularly enviously generous incentives for very low emissions green hydrogen. Do you have any insights or thoughts based on your Ontario contacts about their effects?
My first thought on the IRA was great. This is fantastic. And then my second thought was, oh shoot, this is going to drive a lot of capital and a lot of talent and a lot of interest into the states that we could really use right now. So what it does do, I think, is it poses as a challenge. We need to make sure we're keeping pace as Ontario, not just with other provinces, but with US jurisdictions in Europe. There's a finite amount of technicians and talent engineers and money who's chasing this sector. If Ontario is putting forward really talented, great opportunities, such as the rate options we discussed, then I think we will remain competitive and we'll keep a place here. Eventually, if we can leverage our tremendous, hydroelectric resources in the north, leverage resources from Quebec and Manitoba, we can be a major exporter of getting it down to the Midwest, which is actually a larger hydrogen consumer than Germany is. So that's I certainly see as a much nearer term export opportunity, especially because we can transport it by pipeline at a much lower capital cost. We don't need to freeze it than putting it on ships. So I definitely see us exporting to Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan in Indiana, especially over within the next 5 years, much larger volumes than we can ever hope to get to Germany. But it's definitely a ball in our court to make sure that we're competitive and we don't lose some of the momentum to what's happening in the US.
Yeah, I note that. Again, $1 US per kilogram, called $1.30 Canadian. Assume the electrolyzer costs, eventually become maybe a quarter of the overall cost. So if we have to produce hydrogen for ballpark $1 Canadian per kilogram, then you'd want to have the price of electricity somewhere in the range of 2 cents per kilowatt hour, or perhaps a little bit more as possible, say with high temperature electrolyzers, such as could be paired with nuclear power plants. So yeah, that was just some of the background math that I'd done. Okay, returning back in proper order here. David Johnson had asked about virtual power price agreements, and I'd actually noted a very similar question myself in my notebook here. How would David mentioned that IESO, the system operator, has pushed very hard against the concept of quote unquote wheeling power. How would the change be addressed, or is there a path forward to gain their favor, or at least their consent to be able to do this?
So one of the challenges we've had in Ontario with VPPAs is a lot of them were proposed and initiated for the purposes of avoiding global adjustment charges. Effectively, folks wanted to set up offsite wind resources at a distance, solar resources, purchase that power directly so that they don't have to participate in relieving some of those auto market costs. And that's great, but if you're a large industrial facility and you're in a VPPA and you're not paying that global adjustment, the mom and pop store is and the mom and pop are. So the government was not out of any interest in suppressing VPPAs, but in the interest of recovering system costs, pushed back against that and then hasn't allowed that to come to fruition. I think hydrogen is different in the sense that no one is producing hydrogen to avoid global adjustment. I mean, that can't be one of the reasons you're doing it. You're producing hydrogen for the purposes of selling that hydrogen. So insofar as we do need to recover some system costs through hydrogen producers, and I myself would not encourage any kind of regime that allows them to fully avoid system costs and to fully opt out of those. There has to be some kind of cost recovery as well. I think what we can convince the ISO is that even with significant drop in surplus baseload generation over the coming years, we are going to have instances, especially within parts of the grid, if not grid-wide, where we do have SPG and we do have curtailment. If the ISO can be convinced that that curtailment can be entirely deployed for hydrogen production, so that instead of paying those generators, which we still pay if we're curtailing them after a certain number of hours a year, instead of paying them for nothing, we could at least pay them and put that energy resource into hydrogen. I think that will release some of their concerns, especially if we can connect that with phasing out natural gas from the system, or at least reducing the carbon intensity of natural gas we do use. That's two big priorities, and we're going to see what that report looks like on October 7th. I'm hoping to see a big part for hydrogen, and then that can connect EPPAs with the phase-out plans in a great symbiotic relationship.
And again, just for my benefit, I probably missed this. The October 7th report is which report again?
So that's going to be a report on phasing out natural gas fired generation. We had a report came out last year that analyzed whether it was possible to do so by 2030. The report said that it would cost several tens of billions of dollars extra and may result in rolling brownouts. So we decided we're not going to do that. But the government came back and said, if we can't do 2030, when can we achieve it? And what are some of the near-term measures we can do to relieve our reliance on natural gas? Again, with Pickering going offline and new demand coming on, it has been a critical factor in keeping the grid running.
Got it. Yes. Okay. Very good. Let's see. Barry Prentice asked, with all this enthusiasm for hydrogen, when do we see the ban on the use of hydrogen in airships lifted? Is hydrogen safe for every use except this one? Maybe I can field this one in that hydrogen is being considered for air travel, for sure. Airships, I think that we'll probably stick with the helium. The optics of the Hindenburg still loom like it's like that. What was that Star Wars poster way back in the day when the young kids here and there's a shadow of Darth Vader on some wall. Anyway, yeah, I think airships will probably stick with helium. We'll say that they've got that market. Let's see. Next, Robert Stasko from the Hydrogen Business Council in Ontario said, I note the Ontario government has tasked Atura Power, to build out hubs across the province. Will this capture hub opportunities that may arise organically, such as in Mississauga, Bruce Grey, I guess that's near the Bruce Power Plant, and Durham regions?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? It cut out just a second.
Sure, yeah. So does the Ontario government's hydrogen hub plan, through Atura Power, will that capture opportunities that may arise organically in Mississauga, Cummins, Hydrogenics, Bruce Grey, and Durham?
I think so. So certainly a different range of opportunities. We're looking at Bruce. It's a lot of that is nuclear produced hydrogen. Mississauga is in the manufacturing space and the consumption space of it. So they're certainly complementary. If we're building electrolyzers and fuel cells in Mississauga, we're sending them out to the 401 corridor near Sarnia and connecting it to the 401 trucking system. I think that's great. I think in terms of hydrogen hubs, that for me really is a focus on having end users closer, so that if we have a scaled electrolyzer facility, we want it to be as many megawatts as possible, reduce those costs. Then we have quite, Shell, we have other, we have Husky there, we have some of the large chemical refiners in the same area. Instead of transporting that distribution infrastructure across many miles, we can have it quite concentrated. Whether that electrolyzer is built in Mississauga or Sarnia, I think is pretty innocuous. We can truck it in. It's a pretty close distance as well. But really, it's the low density of hydrogen that's the challenge. And the fact that we do need storage facilities to keep it in place, rather have one large one in the same location and then building from there, rather than lots spread out where you have to repeat the same kind of storage and distribution costs time and again.
Okay, super. So Victoria Borac,
I do want to throw in one point here really quickly about the Hindenburg. So the Hindenburg, which was currently at the moment had 100 people, only like 33 of them died. So it's a terrifying photo, but I want to point out that the majority of the people in the Hindenburg did survive, which is not always the case on planes. Not a comment on whether we should be flying with hydrogen, but the Hindenburg photos were much worse than it looked. Most of them survived. That's all I'll say. Whether or not it's safe is not up to me.
I think our
Alex, it's Helen Plattis. I love your optimism. I was just saying, I love your optimism.
Right. So I guess I'll try that out with our marketing communications folks. If people ask me, well, only 33 people. Okay, sorry. Now, getting back to being serious, but yes. So Victor had a question on, is there room for hydrogen from pyrolysis? This is methane to hydrogen with solid carbon, or graphene possibly, because the carbon black or the carbon product can be sold and sort of cross-subsidize the hydrogen. I think what he's really asking is it on the Ontario government's radar? Do they know this other process also exists?
So a couple of things there. So the graphene, I think, makes sense technically, but the high demand for graphene and its high market price at the moment, my read of the analysis has been that it's not the best use for hydrogen production. There's other higher value added processes for graphene. If that changes, great. With pyrolysis, again, I think it's really this government response to, can we take things out of the lab and into the field? Right now, we're not seeing a lot of commercial ready, or at least commercially deployed pyrolysis-based hydrogen production. So no, it hasn't really come up on the government's radar. I think if we do see pyrolysis-based hydrogen coming up, please go talk to Minister Smith's office, talk to the ministry, let them know what it is that can help you scale. But at the moment, it's not one of the big factors. I think it's probably mentioned once or twice in the report, but not as a leading proponent.
Right. Okay. So just to round this out, so the graphene would be a byproduct. It wouldn't be like a feedstock or a catalyst for the process. Now there is one. I'd call it commercial scale, industrial scale pyrolysis process. It's the Olive Creek plant in Nebraska from Monolith Corporation, a company I am hoping very strongly to woo into joining the Canadian Hydrogen Fuel Cell Association. Actually, ad break. If you're on this call and have interest in hydrogen, you can join us. CHFCA.ca, I think /join. Maybe Nicholas, if you could put that link in there, okay, and the ad break. So one advantage of this process is that you don't have to worry about, do you have the right geology to store CO2 underground forever and a day? I'm not as familiar with Ontario's geology, but it is a valuable thing. I did look up once, so carbon black, a common byproduct, is typically used in tires. Canada has 3 tire manufacturing facilities, and it is also used for other purposes as well. But here's to hoping we can lure some pyrolysis plants into Canada as well.
One of the last things I'd like to say before we have a moment here to wrap up as well. So I've worked with a lot of folks here in Ontario and Canada. I'm moving to the UK. We're actually flying out on Friday to start a new position at Policy Exchange. If folks here are hydrogen manufacturers of electrolyzers, fuel cells, or other hydrogen inputs, and you're interested in looking at opportunities to export to and/or raise capital in the UK, please shoot me a note. There's some opportunities coming up over the coming months to help develop some trade relations with the UK specifically and Europe down the line, including some events taking place in London later this year. Please shoot me a note. Would love to chat with you and help champion some of Canada's technology leaders and energy innovators within the global marketplace. Would love to get connected. Thank you.
Right, fantastic. Now I realize we're at like 9:58, and I worry that if I take any more questions, we won't really have a good enough time to wrap up. We will be able to save. I think there are a couple of questions we weren't able to get to, so I just want to respect everyone's time. Make sure we close at I guess what 1 p.m. Eastern, as it is. So thank you very, very much to Alex, our webinar lead, for his presentation here. Is your contact information on this this slide deck here, Alex, or do you want to maybe put your preferred email address or something?
I'll just put my email address in here. Yes.
Sure, that'd be fantastic. Yes. So once again, thank you very much. I do again want to make sure to credit Nicholas Hilario, CHFCA's operations manager, the veteran of our team here, with basically setting everything up. I'm just doing a bunch of talking. I'm like that. Who's that? Ron McLean guy, the calm guy who sits beside Don Cherry. I'm just the guy who talks here. Nicholas does the 99+% of the work that isn't already done by the webinar host. And so thank you all very much for attending. I hope it was informative. Please give us feedback. You can reach out to us, or I guess by this point, if you've clicked on the link, you probably know how to reach us, but happy to try and answer any questions. And certainly maybe we'll leave this up just for another minute or two, just in case some people are trying to grab Alex's email address. And that way, you guys can all connect soon. Nicholas, did you want to add a few words here while we're giving folks time to pull down the information they want?
Yes, the recording of the webinar will be circulated upon the conclusion of today's session. So please do keep an eye out for the webinar link. Thank you.
Super. And I believe there were a couple links on slide 8 that might not have been live. If you're one of the folks who was asking about it, could you just email us separately? We'll work with Alex to make sure that we can get the link to you. I think there was one, like a form letter perhaps of what to send to the government in support of, I think it was virtual power plants. And there was a second link as well. But yes, okay, I see we're at 10 o'clock here. So yeah, thank you all very, very much for attending. I hope it was a useful investment of your lunchtime, your probable lunchtime at this point in the day. And we are trying to get a speaker from the US, or we're trying, so that we can discuss the Inflation Reduction Act a bit further, so that we can learn from them perhaps how Canadian companies can, sort of noodle our way in to that, perhaps with American partners or something of that sort. So we'll try to have that in September if scheduling permits. All right. Well, thank you all very much, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye, Alex. Good luck in the UK.
Thank you.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Good luck in the UK.